In the southeastern corner of the Greek peninsula, nestled within a fertile valley surrounded by formidable mountain ranges, there existed a city unlike any other in the ancient world. This was Sparta, known to its inhabitants as Lacedaemon, a place where every citizen was a soldier, where the state demanded absolute loyalty, and where the very fabric of society was woven with threads of discipline, austerity and military excellence. For nearly 3 centuries, from approximately 650 BC to 3001 BC, Sparta stood as the dominant land power in Greece, its fearsome warriors inspiring both admiration and terror throughout the Mediterranean world. The story of Sparta is one of paradoxes. Here was a society that produced some of history's greatest warriors, yet left behind few monuments or written records. A culture that valued conformity and collective identity, yet gave its women unprecedented freedom and power. A military machine of extraordinary efficiency, yet one built upon the backs of an enslaved population that outnumbered its masters by a ratio of perhaps 7 to 1. A state that could produce 300 men willing to die to the last at Thermopylae, yet would ultimately crumble when its rigid system could no longer adapt to changing circumstances. The physical setting of Sparta shaped its character in fundamental ways. The city lay on the banks of the Eurotas River, the largest river in the Peloponnese, in a region known as Laconia. This valley, flanked by the towering Taygetos Mountains to the west and the Parnon Range to the east, formed a natural fortress. These geographic barriers provided protection from invasion and allowed Sparta to develop in relative isolation from the political turmoil that consumed other Greek city-states. The valley floor was fertile, capable of supporting agriculture, though not so abundantly that it encouraged commercial ambitions or trade with the outside world. The climate of Laconia was Mediterranean, with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. The land produced olives, grapes, and grain, the staples of Greek agriculture. But what truly defined Sparta's economy was not what its land produced naturally, but what the Spartans had taken by conquest. Through military campaigns in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Sparta had subjugated the neighbouring region of Messenia, nearly doubling the territory under its control and acquiring a vast population of agricultural workers who would become known as helots. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site of Sparta had been inhabited since Neolithic times, with settlements dating back to approximately 3000 BC. During the Bronze Age, the region was part of the Mycenaean civilization, that sophisticated culture immortalized in Homer's epics. When the Mycenaean world collapsed around 1100 BC, plunging Greece into a dark age, the area that would become Sparta experienced the same disruptions as the rest of Greece. It was during the subsequent centuries in the period historians call the Greek Dark Age that the Dorian Greeks moved into the region, bringing with them the language and cultural traditions that would form the basis of classical Sparta. By the 8th century BC, Sparta had emerged as a collection of 4 or 5 villages grouped together in the Eurotas Valley. Unlike other Greek cities, Sparta never built extensive walls around its urban centre. The Spartans themselves would later claim, with characteristic pride, that their soldiers were the walls of the city. This lack of fortification was both a statement of confidence and a practical reflection of their geographic advantages. The mountains provided natural defence, and any enemy approaching Sparta would have to march through territory the Spartans knew intimately. The transformation of Sparta from a typical Greek polis into the unique military society for which it became famous did not happen overnight. It was the product of specific historical circumstances, deliberate policy choices, and, if the ancient sources are to be believed, the vision of a single remarkable lawgiver whose very existence remains shrouded in mystery. No figure looms larger in Spartan tradition than Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver credited with establishing virtually every aspect of the Spartan way of life. Yet paradoxically, almost nothing certain is known about him. Ancient historians could not agree on when he lived, with dates ranging from the 11th century BC to the 8th century BC. They could not agree on his lineage, some claiming he belonged to the Agiad royal house, others to the Eurypontid house. Some ancient writers even questioned whether he was a real person at all, or merely a mythical figure to whom the Spartans attributed their distinctive customs in order to give them an aura of ancient, divinely sanctioned authority. According to the most popular tradition, preserved by the Greek biographer Plutarch, Lycurgus was the younger brother of a Spartan king. When his brother died, leaving an infant son as heir, Lycurgus served as regent and guardian to the young prince. However, he found Sparta in a state of disorder and lawlessness, torn by internal conflicts and lacking the discipline that would later define it. Rather than seizing power for himself, Lycurgus embarked on an extraordinary journey to study the laws and customs of other civilizations. His travels reportedly took him first to Crete, where he studied the laws attributed to Minos and observed a society organized along military lines. From Crete, he sailed to Ionia in Asia Minor, where he encountered the wealthy, sophisticated cities of the Eastern Greeks. He travelled to Egypt, ancient even then, where he observed a society rigidly divided into classes, with the warrior caste separate from craftsmen and farmers. Some traditions even claimed he ventured as far as Libya, the Iberian Peninsula and India, though these journeys may be later embellishments meant to enhance his legend. What Lycurgus learned from his travels was that a strong society required strong institutions, clear laws, and citizens dedicated to the common good rather than private gain. He saw that luxury and wealth led to corruption and weakness, while discipline and austerity bred strength and unity. He observed that societies flourished when citizens had a shared sense of purpose and when the education of the young was systematically directed toward producing capable, virtuous adults. After years abroad, Lycurgus was recalled to Sparta. The stories say that the citizens, having endured continued disorder and weak leadership, begged him to return and restore order to their city. Before implementing his reforms, Lycurgus travelled to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred shrine in Greece, to seek the blessing of Apollo. The oracle's response was extraordinary. The priestess addressed Lycurgus not as a man, but as beloved of the gods, declaring him more divine than human. She prophesied that the constitution he would give to Sparta would make it the most famous city in Greece. Armed with divine approval, Lycurgus returned to Sparta and set about revolutionizing its society. The core of his reforms was embodied in what came to be known as the Great Leuctra, a constitutional document that established the framework of Spartan government and society. Remarkably, this document was never written down. Lycurgus believed that laws should live in the hearts and actions of the people, not on tablets of stone or sheets of papyrus that could be destroyed or altered. This oral tradition meant that the exact content of the Great Leuctra remained somewhat mysterious, but ancient sources give us a general understanding of its major provisions. The first and most fundamental reform was the establishment of a unique system of dual kingship. Sparta would be ruled by two kings simultaneously, drawn from two distinct royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, both claiming descent from Heracles. These kings held their positions for life and passed them to their eldest sons, but their powers were carefully limited and balanced against each other. Neither king could act without the approval of the other in civil matters, though they could serve as military commanders independently. This system was designed to prevent tyranny, as each king served as a check on the power of the other. To further balance royal power, Lycurgus created the Gerousia, a council of elders consisting of 28 men over the age of 60, plus the two kings. These elders served for life and were chosen from among the aristocratic families of Sparta. The Gerousia functioned as a supreme court, prepared proposals for the popular assembly, and could veto decisions they deemed harmful to the state. Candidates for the Gerousia were selected by an unusual method. They would walk before the assembly of citizens, and the people would shout their approval or disapproval. The candidate who received the loudest acclamation, as measured by judges sequestered in a nearby building, would be elected. Below the Gerousia stood the Ephorate, a board of 5 magistrates elected annually from among the full citizens. The ephors wielded considerable power. They presided over meetings of the Gerousia and the popular assembly. They could prosecute even the kings for misconduct. They acted as overseers of the educational system and guardians of Spartan customs. In Russian affairs, they received ambassadors and conducted diplomatic correspondence. 2 ephors accompanied each king on military campaigns to ensure he acted in accordance with Spartan law. The ephorate was one of the most distinctive features of the Spartan constitution, providing a democratic element in what was otherwise an oligarchic system. The final component of the government was the assembly, known as the Apella or Ecclesia, which consisted of all male Spartan citizens over the age of 30. The assembly voted on major decisions, including declarations of war and peace, treaties with foreign powers, and the election of elders and ephors. However, the assembly's power was more limited than in democratic Athens. Citizens could not propose motions, they could only vote yes or no on proposals put forward by the Gerousia. The voting method was primitive, citizens shouting their approval or opposition, with the ephors judging which side was louder. If the ephors felt the assembly had made an unwise decision, the Gerousia had the power to veto it. This complex governmental structure, with its checks and balances, its mixture of monarchic, oligarchic and democratic elements, was admired by political philosophers throughout antiquity. Plato and Aristotle both praised the Spartan constitution as an example of a mixed government that combined the best features of different systems while avoiding their extremes. The system was designed for stability, and it succeeded remarkably well. While other Greek cities experienced constant revolutions and changes of government, Sparta maintained its basic constitutional structure for centuries. But Lycurgus's reforms went far beyond government structure. He sought to remake Spartan society from top to bottom, to create a community where every citizen was a soldier and where the good of the state superseded all private interests. This required economic reforms as radical as his political ones. The most controversial of these was the redistribution of land. According to tradition, Lycurgus persuaded the Spartans to pool all their land and redistribute it equally among the citizens. Each male citizen received a plot called a kleros, worked by helots, that was sufficient to support his family and provide his contribution to the communal messes. This economic equality was meant to prevent the accumulation of wealth by some citizens at the expense of others, which Lycurgus saw as a source of social conflict and corruption. Modern scholars debate whether such a complete redistribution ever actually occurred. Land ownership patterns are difficult to trace, and it seems likely that some Spartan families remained wealthier than others throughout Spartan history. Nevertheless, the ideal of economic equality among citizens became a fundamental part of Spartan ideology. Spartans were forbidden to engage in trade or craft production. They were not to accumulate gold or silver. According to legend, Spartan currency consisted of iron bars too heavy to carry and too common to be valuable, making it impossible to hoard wealth. While this story may be exaggerated, it reflects the real Spartan distrust of money and commercial activity. The absence of walls around Sparta, the simple style of Spartan life, the plain food eaten in the communal messes, the identical clothing worn by all citizens, all of this was meant to embody the principle that Spartans were equals, differing not in wealth or luxury, but only in virtue and service to the state. The Greek word homoioi, which the Spartans used to describe themselves, is often translated as equals, but actually means more like peers or similars, men who shared a common way of life and common values, even if they did not possess exactly equal wealth. The creation of the communal dining halls, called syssitia, was another key element of Lycurgus's reforms. Every male citizen was required to belong to one of these dining clubs, typically containing about 15 members. Members ate together every night, contributing food from their kleros. The meals were deliberately simple and frugal. Black broth, made from pork, blood, salt and vinegar, was the traditional Spartan dish. Famous throughout Greece for its revolting taste, the Spartans claimed to like it, considering it a mark of their hardiness and disdain for luxury. The syssitia served multiple purposes. They reinforced the principle of equality, as rich and poor ate the same simple food together. They fostered bonds of comradeship and loyalty among the members, who would fight together as a unit in battle. They removed men from their families for a significant portion of each day, weakening family ties and strengthening loyalty to the state and to one's fellow citizens. A Spartan who could not afford his contributions to the syssitia, either because his kleros was unproductive or because he had lost his land, would lose his citizenship and be reduced to the status of an inferior. This threat helped maintain the system, as every Spartan knew that participation in the communal life was the price of citizenship. According to legend, after establishing his reforms and seeing that they had taken root, Lycurgus made one final dramatic gesture. He told the Spartans he was going to consult the oracle at Delphi once more, but first he made them swear to obey his laws until he returned. Then he departed Sparta and never came back. Some stories say he starved himself to death. Others say he simply disappeared, travelling to distant lands. By never returning, he bound the Spartans forever to their oath. They could never change his laws without violating their sacred promise. Whether Lycurgus was a real historical figure or a mythical embodiment of various reforms that occurred over a long period, the system attributed to him transformed Sparta into something unique in the ancient world, a society wholly devoted to military excellence, where every institution, every custom, every aspect of daily life was directed toward creating and maintaining the finest army Greece had ever seen. The Spartan social system was rigidly stratified, dividing the population into clearly defined classes with different rights, obligations, and ways of life. Understanding this hierarchy is essential to understanding how Spartan society functioned, for it was this pyramid of classes that allowed a relatively small number of full citizens to maintain control over a much larger population and to devote themselves entirely to military training. At the apex of this social pyramid stood the Spartiates, the full citizens of Sparta. Only Spartiates enjoyed complete political rights, voting in the assembly and being eligible for election to the Gerousia or the Ephorate. To be counted among the Spartiates, a man had to meet several strict requirements. He had to be born of 2 Spartan parents, proving his lineage and ensuring the purity of the citizen body. He had to have successfully completed the agoge, the brutal state-sponsored education and training program that all Spartan boys entered at age 7. He had to be at least 30 years old, the age at which Spartans attained full political rights, and he had to contribute his share to one of the syssitia, the communal dining groups, which required owning or controlling enough productive land. The number of Spartiates was never large. At Sparta's peak around 480 BC, there may have been around 8,000 to 10,000 full citizens. By the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, that number had dwindled to perhaps 1,500. This decline in citizen numbers, called oliganthropia by the Greeks, would eventually prove fatal to Sparta's power. These strict requirements for citizenship, combined with losses in war and the inability or unwillingness to expand the citizen body, meant that Sparta's military strength rested on an ever-shrinking base. Spartiates were forbidden to engage in any productive labour. They could not farm their own land, practice a craft, or engage in trade. Their sole occupations were training for war, serving in the army and participating in the governance of the state. This was not a life of leisure, however. From age 7 to 60, a Spartiate's life was highly regimented. Even after completing the agoge at age 30 and being allowed to marry and establish a household, Spartan men spent much of their time training, eating at their syssitia, and serving in the army on campaign. Only at age 60 could a Spartan retire from active military duty, though he remained subject to call in emergencies. The austerity and discipline of Spartan life was legendary throughout Greece. Spartans wore simple clothing, typically a red cloak that became their distinctive garment. They cut their hair short and cultivated long beards, in contrast to other Greeks who favoured longer hair and shorter beards. They spoke in a terse, direct manner, using as few words as possible to convey their meaning. This brevity of speech, called laconism after the region of Laconia, gave rise to many famous Spartan sayings. When Philip the King of Macedon sent a message to Sparta saying, "If I enter Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground," the Spartans replied with a single word, "if." This ideal of the Spartiate as the professional warrior citizen devoted entirely to the state and disdaining private wealth and comfort was the heart of Spartan ideology. However, the reality was somewhat more complex. Some Spartans were wealthier than others. Some families had larger and more productive estates. Over time, wealth became concentrated in fewer hands, exacerbating the decline in citizen numbers. Not all Spartans lived up to the austere ideal. Some were punished for cowardice in battle, others for failing to meet their obligations to their syssitia. These men were demoted to the status of hypomenes, inferiors, losing their citizenship but remaining free. Below the Spartiates in the social hierarchy were the perioikoi, literally those dwelling around. The perioikoi were free men who lived in dozens of towns and villages throughout Laconia and Messenia, but were not citizens of Sparta proper. They did not attend the Spartan assembly, could not vote on political matters, and had no say in the decisions of the Spartan state. Within their own communities, however, they governed themselves, electing local magistrates and managing their own affairs. The origins of the perioikoi are unclear. Some may have been the descendants of pre-Dorian inhabitants of the region who maintained their freedom when the Spartans conquered the area. Others may have been Dorians who settled in the region at the same time as the Spartans, but were not incorporated into the Spartan citizen body. Still others may have been communities that voluntarily allied themselves with Sparta and accepted a subordinate status in exchange for protection. The perioikoi played an essential economic role in Spartan society. Since Spartiates were forbidden to engage in trade or craft production, these activities fell to the perioikoi. They were the merchants, artisans, and craftsmen of the Spartan state. They produced the weapons and armour used by the Spartan army, including the distinctive Spartan shields with their lambda symbol. They engaged in trade with other Greek cities, both by land and sea. They mined and quarried the natural resources of Laconia and Messenia. The economic prosperity of the Spartan state depended heavily on the industry and commerce of the perioikoi. In addition to their economic role, the perioikoi served in the Spartan army. They fought as hoplites, the heavy infantry that formed the core of Greek armies, equipped and trained much like the Spartiates themselves. In major battles, perioikoi might outnumber Spartiates by a significant margin. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, for example, there were 5,000 Spartiates but perhaps an equal number of perioikoi. The perioikoi also served in the Spartan navy, such as it was, and as marines on ships. Despite their military service and economic importance, the perioikoi remained second-class members of Spartan society. They were subject to Spartan foreign policy decisions, but had no voice in making those decisions. They could be called up for military service at Sparta's command. They were expected to follow Sparta's lead in international affairs. However, their subordinate status was not without benefits. The perioikoi enjoyed security and stability under Spartan protection. They were free to accumulate wealth through trade and craft production, opportunities denied to the Spartiates. Some perioikoi undoubtedly became quite prosperous, far wealthier than many full citizens of Sparta. The exact legal relationship between Sparta and the perioikoi remains somewhat mysterious. Ancient sources provide frustratingly little information about the details of perioikoi governance or the precise nature of their subordination to Sparta. What is clear is that the system worked for both parties. The perioikoi provided essential services to the Spartan state and showed remarkable loyalty over centuries. Unlike the helots, who revolted repeatedly, there is no record of the perioikoi ever rebelling against Spartan rule. This suggests that their position, while subordinate, was sufficiently advantageous that they saw no benefit in challenging the status quo. At the bottom of the Spartan social hierarchy were the helots, and it is here that we encounter the darkest aspect of Spartan society. The helots were state-owned serfs who worked the land for the Spartans. Unlike slaves in other Greek cities, who might be of any nationality and serve in households or workshops, helots were an indigenous population, the descendants of Greeks who had been conquered and enslaved by the Spartans. Most helots were Messenians, from the region west of Laconia that Sparta had conquered in brutal wars during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The origin of helotry remains debated among historians. According to one ancient tradition, the first helots came from the city of Helos in Laconia, which the Spartans conquered and enslaved. Another tradition holds that helots were prisoners taken in the Messenian Wars. What seems clear is that helotry arose when the Spartans, having conquered neighbouring territories, chose not to kill or expel the male population, or sell the women and children into slavery, as was common in Greek warfare, but instead to keep them in their homeland as agricultural workers. This decision provided the Spartans with a large, stable workforce, but it also created a potentially dangerous enemy within their borders. Helots lived in family groups, worked assigned plots of land, and were obliged to give half their produce to the Spartiate who owned their kleros. They kept the other half for themselves. This meant helots could, in theory, accumulate some surplus and enjoy a modest standard of living. They lived in their own houses rather than being confined to slave quarters. They could marry and raise families. In these respects, their condition differed from that of chattel slaves in other Greek cities. However, helots had no freedom and no legal rights. They could be killed by Spartans without legal consequence. They were subject to ritual humiliation designed to remind them of their inferior status. Plutarch records that helots were forced to get drunk and perform ridiculous dances at Spartan feasts so that young Spartans could see the degradation that resulted from intemperance. Helots wore distinctive clothing, a dogskin cap and leather garment, marking them as different from free men. They were forbidden to train as warriors or to carry weapons, except when serving with the Spartan army in times of great need. The numerical imbalance between Spartans and helots was stark and grew worse over time. Ancient sources suggest that helots may have outnumbered Spartiates by a ratio of 7-1 or even 10-1. This meant that Sparta was, in effect, a small military garrison occupying a hostile country. The Spartans were acutely aware of this danger. According to Thucydides, most Spartan institutions were designed with an eye towards security against the helots. Sparta's internal police force, the Crypteia, had as one of its primary functions the surveillance and terrorization of the helot population. The Crypteia was a secretive organization whose details remain obscure. Young Spartans of exceptional ability were selected to serve in it. These young men would be sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and instructions to kill any helots who seemed particularly strong, intelligent, or rebellious. They were to operate at night, striking without warning, keeping the helot population in a constant state of fear. The existence of such an institution reveals the depths of Spartan paranoia about helot revolts and their willingness to use terror as a tool of social control. Despite these precautions, helot revolts did occur, and they struck terror into Spartan hearts. The most serious revolt erupted in 464 BC, when a massive earthquake struck Sparta, destroying much of the city and killing thousands. The helots, seeing their masters weakened and disorganized, rose in rebellion. They fortified Mount Itham in Messenia and held out for years against Spartan attempts to reduce them. Sparta was forced to call on its allies for help, including Athens, though the Athenians were later dismissed when the Spartans feared they might sympathize with the rebels. The revolt was finally suppressed, but at great cost, and it left a permanent mark on Spartan consciousness. The helot system was both the foundation of Spartan power and its greatest weakness. It freed the Spartiates to devote themselves entirely to military training, creating the finest army in Greece, but it also meant that Sparta could never fully commit its forces to external wars, as a significant portion of the army always had to remain at home to guard against helot revolts. It meant that Sparta had to maintain constant vigilance and could never truly relax, and it meant that Sparta's power rested on a foundation that could crumble if the helots ever succeeded in breaking free. There were other, smaller categories within Spartan society. The Mothaics were non-Spartans who had been raised alongside Spartan boys in the agoge, often the sons of helots fathered by Spartiates. If they distinguished themselves, Mothaics could sometimes be granted Spartiate status, though this was rare. The Hippomyanes were men who had been born as Spartiates but had lost their citizenship, usually because they could no longer afford their contributions to the Syssitia, or because they had been convicted of cowardice. The Neodamodes were freed helots, typically those who had served with distinction in military campaigns. These intermediate categories show that Spartan society, for all its rigid structure, had some flexibility and mechanisms for social mobility, even if they were limited. Understanding this social hierarchy is crucial to understanding Sparta's history. The Spartiates, though militarily dominant, were always a small minority. Their power depended on the loyalty of the Perioikoi and the subjugation of the helots. As the number of Spartiates declined over the centuries, this balance became increasingly precarious. The loss of Messenia and its helot population in the 360s BC would prove catastrophic, removing the labour force that had supported the Spartiate lifestyle and accelerating Sparta's decline. The rigid social system that had once been Sparta's strength ultimately became its doom, as it proved unable to adapt to changing circumstances or to expand its citizen base in response to military losses. No aspect of Spartan society has captured the imagination more vividly than the agoge, the rigorous state-sponsored education and training program that every Spartan boy had to endure. The agoge was not merely a school in the modern sense. It was a comprehensive system of indoctrination, physical conditioning, military training and psychological hardening designed to transform boys into elite warriors absolutely loyal to the Spartan state. For Spartans, the agoge was the crucible in which true citizens were forged. For others, it seemed a brutal, dehumanizing institution that produced obedient soldiers at the cost of individual humanity. The agoge began, before birth in a sense, with the Spartan approach to marriage and pregnancy. Spartan women were encouraged to exercise and maintain physical fitness because it was believed this would lead to healthier pregnancies and stronger babies. Unlike women in other Greek cities who lived secluded lives indoors, Spartan women trained alongside men when young, participating in running, wrestling and throwing competitions. The goal was to ensure that Spartan mothers would bear vigorous children capable of becoming warriors. When a baby was born in Sparta, it was not the parents who decided whether the child would be raised. Instead, the infant was brought before the elders of the tribe, who examined it carefully. If the baby appeared healthy and well-formed, the elders allowed the parents to raise it, but if the child seemed weak or deformed, the elders ordered it to be exposed, left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetos. This practice of infanticide, shocking to modern sensibilities, was defended by the Spartans as necessary for maintaining the strength of their warrior population. They believed it was cruel to both the child and the state to raise individuals who could not fulfill their duty as citizens and soldiers. The reliability of ancient accounts of infant exposure is debated by modern scholars. Plutarch describes it as routine practice, but he wrote centuries after Sparta's peak and may have been influenced by literary traditions that exaggerated Spartan harshness. Archaeological excavations have not found the mass infant burials that would be expected if exposure was common. It is possible that infant exposure occurred but was less frequent than sources suggest, or that deformed infants were actually given to helot families to raise rather than being left to die. Regardless of the exact frequency, the tradition reveals Spartan priorities. The state's need for strong warriors superseded parental rights and natural affection. For the first 7 years of life, Spartan children remained with their families. Mothers and nurses raised them, but even in infancy the Spartan approach differed from other Greeks. Spartan babies were bathed in wine rather than water, supposedly to test their constitution. They were not swaddled tightly as was common elsewhere, but were allowed freedom of movement to strengthen their limbs. They were not coddled or indulged, but were taught from the earliest age to be tough, to endure discomfort without complaint, to control their tears and emotions. The real transformation began at age 7, when Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge. This moment marked a fundamental rupture. The boy left his mother's home and would from this day forward belong more to the state than to his family. He joined a group or pack of boys his own age, and this group became his new family. An older youth, an Iron in his late teens or early 20s, supervised the group. The entire system was overseen by a state official called the paidonomos, literally the boy herder, who had ultimate authority over all aspects of the educational program. The boys in the agoge were divided into age grades. The youngest, from 7 to around 14, were called paids. These young boys received basic education in reading, writing, music and dance, but physical training and hardening dominated their lives. They were deliberately underfed and given just enough food to keep them alive, but not enough to satisfy their hunger. The purpose was to teach them resourcefulness and encourage them to steal food. Theft was not punished in itself, but getting caught was, and harshly. Boys caught stealing were whipped severely. The lesson was clear: a good Spartan must be cunning and stealthy, able to take what he needs without being detected. The paids wore only a single cloak throughout the year, summer and winter alike, with no shoes and no undergarments. They slept on beds they made themselves from reeds gathered from the banks of the Eurotas River, which they were required to break by hand rather than cut with a knife. In winter, they were permitted to mix thistledown with the reeds for a bit of extra warmth, but comfort was never the goal. The purpose was to accustom them to hardship, to make them indifferent to physical discomfort, to train their bodies to endure extremes of temperature and privation. Physical training occupied much of each day. The boys ran, wrestled, boxed, threw the javelin and discus, and practiced with weapons. Spartan athletics differed from the competitive sports popular in other Greek cities. The emphasis was not on individual achievement or breaking records, but on practical skills useful in warfare. Wrestling taught close combat techniques. Running built endurance for long marches. Boxing developed the ability to strike and absorb blows. Everything had a military purpose. Music and dance were also part of the curriculum, though even these had a martial character. The boys learned to sing the poems of Tyrtaeus, the 7th century poet whose verses celebrated courage in battle and scorned cowardice. They performed war dances in formation, moving together in synchronized patterns while armed with shields and spears. These dances served both as physical conditioning and as training in the coordinated movements required for phalanx warfare. The Spartans believed music could instill courage and discipline, that the right rhythms and melodies could harmonize the soul and prepare it for battle. Discipline was maintained through a combination of peer pressure and corporal punishment. The older boys had authority to punish the younger, and they used it freely. Whipping was common for any infraction. The Spartans believed that physical pain taught boys to endure suffering without complaint. One famous Spartan story tells of a boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned by his superiors, the boy stood silent while the fox clawed and bit him, even as it gnawed through to his vitals. The boy died without crying out, preferring death to the shame of admitting he had been caught. Whether this story is literally true or an instructive fable, it illustrates what the Spartans valued: absolute endurance, unwillingness to betray weakness, and choosing death over dishonor. The boys were also taught to speak in the characteristically terse Spartan manner. Long speeches and elaborate rhetoric were despised as signs of weakness and dishonesty. A Spartan should speak plainly, using the minimum words necessary to convey his meaning. During meals at the Syssitia, the boys were encouraged to listen to the conversations of the men, learning through observation how adult Spartans conducted themselves. They could ask questions and make observations, but they had to do so respectfully and concisely. Rambling or foolish speech earned them a bite on the thumb from the elder sitting next to them. Around age 14, boys entered the next stage, becoming paidiskoi. This phase lasted until age 20 and represented a transition toward more serious military training. The boys' bodies were now strong enough for more demanding physical conditioning. The training became more intense, the discipline harsher. They continued to go barefoot and wear only a single cloak. They received no increase in their rations, continuing to rely on cunning and stealth to supplement their hunger. During this period, the boys were organised into what the Spartans called herds, groups that trained and competed together under the leadership of an Aaron. These herds developed intense internal loyalty. The boys learned to trust their companions absolutely, knowing their survival in battle would depend on the man fighting beside them. Rivalries between herds encouraged competition and excellence, but the ultimate goal was always collective rather than individual achievement. The paidiskoi received systematic training in hoplite warfare. They learned to march in formation, to maintain the tight ranks of the phalanx, to advance and retreat in unison without breaking cohesion. They practiced with the distinctive Spartan shield, large and heavy, which protected not only the bearer but also the man to his left. They trained with the spear, the primary weapon of the hoplite, learning the overhand thrust that would strike at an enemy's face and throat above his shield. They learned the songs and the rhythms of the war march, the steady pace and synchronized steps that allowed an army to move as a single entity across the battlefield. Mock battles between the herds were a regular feature of training. These competitions could be surprisingly brutal. Ancient sources describe contests where boys fought with such ferocity that they had to be separated to prevent fatalities. The adult supervisors permitted and even encouraged this violence, believing it developed the fighting spirit necessary for real warfare. The pain and injury inflicted in training were considered preparation for the much greater suffering of actual battle. At age 20, if a young man had performed well throughout his training, he advanced to the status of Iron. This was a position of both privilege and responsibility. The Iranians were no longer boys but not yet full citizens. They served as leaders and instructors for the younger age groups while continuing their own military training. The Iron learned leadership, discipline and judgment, skills essential for the officers and NCOs of the Spartan army. It was during this phase that some young men were selected for the Krypteia, the secret service that policed the helot population. The Krypteia remains one of the most mysterious and disturbing aspects of Spartan society. According to Plutarch, the young men chosen for this duty were the best and brightest, those who had excelled throughout the agoge. They were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and instructions to hide during the day and kill helots at night. The purpose of the Krypteia was multiple. It served as a practical training in survival skills, stealth, and killing. It helped control the helot population through random terror, preventing them from organising resistance. It may also have served a ritualistic purpose, allowing young Spartans to commit their first killings before facing enemies in actual warfare, hardening them psychologically for the violence they would have to inflict. The Krypteia represents Sparta at its most brutal, the institutionalization of murder as a tool of education and social control. Not all young men succeeded in the agoge. Those who failed to meet the standards, who showed cowardice or inability to endure the hardships, who were rejected by their peers or deemed unsuitable by their superiors, would not become full citizens. They might remain in Sparta as Hippomenes, inferiors, or they might leave the city entirely. The pressure on each boy to succeed must have been enormous. Failure meant not only personal shame but the disappointment of one's family, the loss of citizenship rights, and potentially a life of poverty and obscurity. Those who succeeded continued their training through their 20s, the period called hebons. From age 20 to 30, these young men lived in military barracks, sleeping and eating with their units even if they married. They were subject to military service at any time and could be called up for campaigns lasting months or years. They continued rigorous physical training, practiced military drills, and participated in the civic and religious life of Sparta, but they were still not considered fully mature citizens. Only at age 30 did a Spartan finally achieve full citizenship, He could now vote in the assembly, speak in public debates, and compete for election to the Gerousia or Ephorate. He was expected to marry if he had not already done so and to establish a household. However, even married Spartan men continued to eat their evening meals at their syssitia, maintaining the communal bonds formed during the agoge. They remained subject to military service until age 60, training regularly and ready to march to war at short notice. The communal meals at the syssitia were the adult continuation of the collective life begun in childhood. Each Spartiate belonged to one of these dining clubs, typically containing about 15 members. Membership was by election. Existing members had to approve any new candidate, and a single black bull was sufficient to reject him. This gave the syssitia an exclusive character and created powerful bonds of loyalty among members who knew each had been chosen by his peers. The food at the syssitia was deliberately simple. The famous black broth, a staple of Spartan diet, was made from pork blood, vinegar, and salt. Ancient sources claimed it was so unpalatable that foreigners could not stomach it. One story tells of a visitor from Sybaris, a Greek city famous for its luxury, who tried black broth and declared that now he understood why Spartans were willing to die in battle. Death was preferable to eating such food. The Spartans apparently took pride in their awful cuisine, viewing it as another mark of their superior discipline and endurance. Each member of the syssitia had to contribute a fixed amount of food each month from his kleros: barley, wine, cheese, figs, and a small amount of money to purchase meat and other necessities. Failure to make these contributions meant expulsion from the syssitia and loss of citizenship. This requirement ensured that only those with sufficient economic resources remained full citizens, contributing to the gradual decline in Spartiate numbers over the centuries as some families lost their land or found it insufficient to meet their obligations. The agoge produced warriors of extraordinary quality. Spartans were renowned throughout Greece for their courage, discipline, and military skill. They could march farther, fight longer, and endure greater hardships than soldiers from other cities. In battle, they advanced at a steady pace to the rhythm of flutes, maintaining perfect formation, their red cloaks and lambda-emblazoned shields creating an intimidating spectacle. They fought with cold efficiency without wild war cries or individual heroics, trusting in their training and in the man beside them. For generations, no Greek army could stand against the Spartan phalanx in open battle. But the agoge had costs that extended beyond the obvious brutality of the system. It created men who knew only warfare and obedience, who had been trained since childhood to subsume individual will to collective discipline. Spartans were less capable of adapting to new situations, less innovative in strategy and tactics than soldiers from other cities. The rigidity of their training became a weakness when faced with enemies who fought differently, or when military technology and tactics evolved. The agoge produced superb hoplites, but as warfare changed in the 4th century BC, with light troops, cavalry, and new phalanx formations becoming more important, the Spartans struggled to adapt. The system also contributed to Sparta's demographic decline. The harsh training and harsh life killed some boys and young men. The emphasis on collective life over family weakened ties between husbands and wives and may have contributed to low birth rates. The requirement to contribute to the syssitia meant that any Spartiate who suffered economic misfortune lost his citizenship, permanently reducing the citizen body. The agoge, designed to create the perfect warrior society, ultimately helped destroy that society by making it inflexible and unable to reproduce itself adequately. Nevertheless, for nearly 3 centuries, the agoge functioned as intended, producing generation after generation of warriors who made Sparta the most feared military power in Greece. The men who stood at Thermopylae, who conquered Athens in the Peloponnesian War, who dominated Greece for decades, were all products of this system. Understanding the agoge is essential to understanding why Sparta was able to achieve such military dominance, and also why that dominance could not last. Spartan women occupied a unique position in the ancient Greek world. While women in Athens and most other Greek cities lived secluded lives under the control of male relatives, rarely appearing in public and receiving little education, Spartan women enjoyed remarkable freedom and influence. They trained athletically, owned property, managed estates, and spoke their minds openly. This unusual status for women was not the result of enlightened views about gender equality, but rather a practical necessity of Spartan military society and a consequence of the prolonged absence of men on military campaigns. Like boys, Spartan girls underwent physical training from childhood. They ran, wrestled, threw the discus and javelin, and participated in athletic competitions. Ancient sources describe young Spartan women exercising nude or in short tunics, shocking to Greeks from other cities where female modesty demanded concealing clothing and indoor living. The rationale behind this physical training was explicitly eugenic. The Spartans believed that strong, healthy mothers would bear strong, healthy children, particularly sons who would become warriors. Lycurgus reportedly designed women's physical education specifically to ensure they could produce vigorous offspring. Athletic training for girls typically ended at marriage, which occurred considerably later for Spartan women than for women in other Greek cities. While Athenian girls might marry at 14 or 15 to men much older, Spartan women typically married in their late teens or early 20s to men closest to their own age. This practice had practical benefits. Mature women were more likely to survive childbirth and to produce healthy babies. Relative age parity between spouses may also have created more companionate marriages than were typical elsewhere in Greece, where the age gap between husband and wife reinforced male dominance. Spartan marriage customs were peculiar and seemed barbaric to other Greeks. On her wedding night, the bride's hair was cut short, and she was dressed in male clothing. The groom would visit her secretly at night, and the couple would have intercourse, after which the husband returned to his military barracks to sleep with his comrades. This pattern continued even after the formal marriage. The husband lived with his unit in the barracks, and could only visit his wife clandestinely at night. Plutarch claims some couples had children before they had ever seen each other in daylight. This odd arrangement served multiple purposes. It maintained the primacy of military communal life over family life, ensuring that a man's loyalty to his unit superseded his attachment to his wife. The secrecy and difficulty of meetings was supposed to maintain sexual passion longer than if the couple lived together constantly. The separation also meant Spartan women effectively managed their households independently, making economic decisions without daily male supervision. Property rights for Spartan women were exceptional for the ancient world. Women could inherit property, including land, from their fathers. By the Hellenistic period, it was estimated that women controlled perhaps 40% of the land in Sparta. Women could also manage property independently. With husbands absent on military campaigns or living in barracks, Spartan women necessarily took charge of family estates, directing the work of helots, making agricultural decisions and handling financial matters. This economic power translated into social influence. Spartan women were known for speaking boldly and publicly, for expressing opinions on political and military matters, and for not deferring automatically to male authority. Ancient sources preserve numerous anecdotes about Spartan women's forthright speech. When a woman from another city said to a Spartan woman, "You Spartan women are the only ones who rule their men," the Spartan replied, "That is because we are the only ones who give birth to men." Spartan women were expected to support the military ethos of their society enthusiastically. Mothers reportedly told their sons departing for war to return with their shields or upon them, meaning victorious or dead, since a soldier who lost his shield in flight disgraced himself. When a Spartan woman heard that her son had died fighting bravely, she reportedly said she had borne him for precisely this purpose. These stories, while perhaps not literally true, reflect Spartan values. Women were to encourage male courage, to despise cowardice, and to place duty to the state above familial bonds. The emphasis on producing strong sons meant that Spartan women were valued primarily for their reproductive function, but in a different way than in other Greek cities. Rather than being prized for virginity, modesty, and chastity as in Athens, Spartan women were valued for physical strength, health, and the ability to bear vigorous children. There are even ancient accounts suggesting that Spartans practiced a form of eugenics, encouraging women to mate with the strongest men regardless of marital status, if this would produce superior offspring. Herodotus tells a revealing story about the Spartan queen Gorgo, daughter of King Cleomenes and wife of King Leonidas. When Aristagoras of Miletus came to Sparta seeking military aid against the Persians, he offered Cleomenes increasingly large bribes. Gorgo, though only 8 or 9 years old, advised her father to leave before the foreigner corrupted him. Cleomenes took her advice and refused the bribe. Later, when the Spartans received a secret message from the exiled King Demaratus, warning them of Persian preparations for invasion, it was Gorgo who solved the puzzle of the blank wax tablets, realizing the message was written on the wood underneath the wax. These stories, whether historically accurate or not, were told and retold by Greeks as illustrations of the exceptional nature of Spartan women. They were seen as intelligent, brave, and outspoken in ways that women from other cities were not. Some Greeks admired this. Plato, in his Republic, proposed that women in his ideal city should receive the same education as men and serve as warriors and rulers alongside them, citing Sparta as partial precedent. Other Greeks found Spartan women troubling, too independent, too bold, too powerful. Aristotle blamed Spartan women's excessive liberty for many of Sparta's problems, arguing that their control of property and their independent behaviour undermined male authority and contributed to social instability. The reality, of course, was more complex than either idealization or condemnation suggests. Spartan women, despite their unusual freedoms, still lived in a patriarchal society structured around male military dominance. They could not vote in the assembly, hold political office, or serve in the army. Their primary value lay in producing sons for the state. The freedoms they enjoyed existed because those freedoms served the needs of a military society that required men to be absent for training and warfare. When that military system collapsed in later periods, women's status declined as well. Nevertheless, Spartan women were the freest in the Greek world. They moved in public without male chaperones. They managed property and wealth. They exercised and competed athletically. They received some education, enough to be literate and to engage in intellectual conversation. They spoke boldly and expected to be heard. They were partners in the Spartan system, not merely subordinated victim of it. The contrast with Athens is striking. Athenian women lived confined to the women's quarters of their homes, rarely venturing outside except for religious festivals. They received no formal education. They could not own significant property or conduct legal transactions independently. They were married as young teenagers to men chosen by their fathers. Their primary virtues were silence, modesty, and obedience. The greatest compliment an Athenian woman could receive was to be so respectable that men never spoke about her at all. Spartan women, by comparison, lived in a different world. This did not make Sparta a feminist paradise by any modern standard, but it does complicate our understanding of ancient Greek society. The Greek world was not uniform. Different cities, with different social structures and values, produced very different roles and opportunities for women. Sparta, with its peculiar military culture and its need to keep men focused on warfare rather than household management, created a space where women could exercise unusual autonomy and influence. This unusual status for women may have contributed to Sparta's demographic problems. Ancient sources suggest Spartan women deliberately limited family size, perhaps through contraception, abortion, or sexual abstinence. If women controlled their own reproduction and preferred not to have large families, this could explain why Sparta's population grew so slowly despite the state's desperate need for more citizens. Women who owned property, who had influence and independence, may have been less willing to submit to the dangerous ordeal of repeated pregnancies and childbirth than women in other cities who had fewer options. The voices of Spartan women themselves are lost to history. We have no writings by Spartan women, no poetry or philosophy, no letters or memoirs. What we know comes from male observers, often foreigners, often writing centuries after the events they describe. These sources may exaggerate or misunderstand, they certainly simplify. Real Spartan women must have been as varied in their personalities, abilities and experiences as women anywhere. Some were undoubtedly strong and bold, matching the stereotypes. Others may have been quiet, conventional or unhappy with their roles. What we can say with confidence is that Spartan women occupied a unique position in ancient Greece. They were necessary participants in one of history's most unusual social experiments, the creation of a society wholly devoted to military excellence. Their physical training, property rights, and public voices were not granted out of any abstract belief in equality, but as practical necessities of a system that required men to focus entirely on warfare. Yet the result was that Spartan women enjoyed freedoms and wielded influence that women in other Greek cities could barely imagine. This stands as one of many paradoxes that make Sparta such a fascinating and troubling subject for historical study. In the early 5th century BC, the Greek world faced an existential threat. The Persian Empire, vast and powerful, and ruled from India to Egypt, and now it turned its attention westward toward the fractious, independent city-states of Greece. The clash between Persia and Greece was more than a military conflict. It represented a confrontation between two fundamentally different ways of organizing society. Persian monarchy ruling over subject peoples versus Greek autonomy and self-government. For Sparta, the Persian Wars provided the ultimate test of its military system and produced its most famous moment, the stand of 300 Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae. The Persian threat to Greece emerged gradually. Cyrus the Great had founded the Persian Empire in the mid-6th century BC, conquering the ancient kingdoms of Media, Lydia and Babylon. His successor Cambyses added Egypt. Darius III, taking power in 522 BC, expanded the empire's frontiers and centralized its administration. By 500 BC, Persia controlled more territory and commanded more resources than any empire the world had yet seen. The immediate cause of conflict was the Ionian Revolt. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, had fallen under Persian control when Cyrus conquered Lydia. In 499 BC, these cities rebelled against Persian rule. They sent ambassadors to mainland Greece seeking military assistance. Athens sent 20 ships to help the rebels. Sparta, after initially showing interest, declined to participate, possibly because King Cleomenes felt the enterprise was too risky or the distance too great. The rebellion ultimately failed. By 494 BC, the Persians had reconquered the Ionian cities, destroying Miletus and enslaving or killing many of its inhabitants. But Darius had not forgotten the mainland Greeks who had aided the rebels, particularly Athens. He determined to punish the Greeks and to expand Persian control westward to include the Greek peninsula itself. In 492 BC, Darius sent an army under his general Mardonius across the Hellespont into Thrace. The expedition was disrupted by storms and attacks from Thracian tribes, forcing Mardonius to withdraw. Undeterred, Darius launched a second expedition in 490 BC. A Persian fleet crossed the Aegean Sea, subduing islands along the way, and landed at Marathon on the coast of Attica near Athens. The Athenians, facing invasion, sent a runner to Sparta begging for aid. The Spartans agreed to help but claimed they could not march immediately due to a religious festival, the Carnean Games. Whether this was a genuine religious scruple or a convenient excuse has been debated. By the time Spartan troops arrived, the battle was over. The Athenians, aided only by a small contingent from Plataea, had achieved an astonishing victory, crushing the Persian invasion force and driving them back to their ships. Marathon became a defining moment in an Athenian history and self-identity, the proof that free citizens fighting for their homes could defeat the vast Persian host. Sparta's absence from Marathon did not go unnoticed. The Athenians had saved themselves while Sparta stayed home. This undoubtedly created tensions between the two cities, tensions that would resurface in later years. However, the Persian threat was far from over. Darius died before he could launch another expedition, but his son Xerxes inherited both the Persian throne and his father's determination to conquer Greece. Xerxes spent years preparing for invasion on an unprecedented scale. Ancient sources, probably exaggerated, claim his army numbered over 1 million men. Modern historians estimate perhaps 120,000 to 300,000 troops, still by far the largest military force ever assembled to that point in history. Xerxes assembled soldiers from all corners of his empire: Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Ethiopians, Arabs, and dozens of other peoples. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe, to transport his army. He dug a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow his fleet safe passage. The preparations demonstrated the vast resources and organisational capacity of the Persian Empire. When word reached Greece that this immense force was approaching, the Greek city-states faced a moment of crisis. Many cities, especially those in northern Greece, submitted to Xerxes without resistance, accepting Persian overlordship rather than face destruction. But a coalition of city-states, led by Sparta and Athens, chose to resist. Representatives met at Corinth to plan their defence strategy. The Greeks decided on a two-pronged defensive approach. They would try to stop the Persian army at the narrow pass of Thermopylae in central Greece, while simultaneously blocking the Persian navy at the nearby Straits of Artemisium. These two bottlenecks offered the only realistic chance of offsetting the Persian numerical advantage. In a narrow pass or strait, superior numbers counted for less, and Greek heavy infantry and heavier warships might be able to hold their ground. Sparta was chosen to lead the Greek land forces because of its military reputation, despite Athens providing the majority of ships for the naval effort. However, there was a problem. The time of year was August, when the Spartans were celebrating the Carneia, a religious festival in honour of Apollo during which warfare was forbidden. This was not mere superstition or convenient excuse. The Spartans took their religious obligations with deadly seriousness, believing that violating them would bring divine wrath upon the city. Just 10 years earlier, they had arrived too late to help Athens at Marathon because of similar religious restrictions. Faced with this dilemma, the Spartans found a compromise. They would send an advance force to Thermopylae immediately, under one of their 2 kings, while the main army would follow once the festival ended. King Leonidas was chosen to command this expeditionary force. He selected 300 men to accompany him, not just any 300, but specifically men who had living sons. The significance of this selection has been debated. According to Herodotus, Leonidas expected that this mission would end in death and chose men whose family lines would continue even if they fell in battle. The 300 Leonidas chose were all members of the Hippos, the royal bodyguard, elite warriors even among Spartans. These were men in their prime, veterans of previous campaigns, products of decades of training in the agoge. Each was accompanied by his helots, servants, who would carry supplies and equipment. Along the way to Thermopylae, the Spartan contingent was joined by forces from other cities: 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and smaller detachments from Phocis, Leuctra, Corinth, Mycenae, and Arcadia. By the time they reached the pass, the Greek force numbered approximately 7,000 men. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was named for the thermal springs in the area. The pass was a narrow defile between the mountains and the sea, the only practical route from northern to southern Greece along the east coast. At its narrowest point, the pass was perhaps only 50 to 100 feet wide, barely enough room for a cart to travel. This geography made it an ideal defensive position. The Persians could not use their cavalry effectively in such cramped terrain, and their numerical superiority would be diminished since they could only attack on a narrow front. The Greeks took position at the middle gate, the narrowest section of the pass, where the Phocians had previously built a defensive wall. Leonidas posted the Phocians themselves on the heights of Mount Kallidromos to guard against any attempt to outflank the position using a mountain path called the Anapaia. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy at Artemisium, fighting to prevent the Persians from landing troops behind the defenders at Thermopylae. The Persian army arrived in mid-August. Xerxes, surveying the Greek position from his throne set up on a hilltop overlooking the pass, was reportedly astounded at the small size of the defending force. He sent scouts to observe them. The scouts reported that the Spartans were outside the wall, some exercising naked, others combing their long hair. Xerxes laughed at this seeming nonchalance in the face of his massive army, but Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king who served as Xerxes' advisor, warned him that these behaviours were Spartan customs before battle, that they were preparing themselves to fight to the death, and that the Spartans were the finest warriors in Greece. According to Plutarch, Xerxes sent a herald to the Greeks, demanding they surrender their weapons. Leonidas gave his famous reply, 2 words in Greek, molon labe koiopshoiao, come and take them. This terse response, perfectly embodying the Spartan style of speech, has echoed through history as a declaration of defiant courage. Xerxes waited 4 days, perhaps expecting the Greeks to lose their nerve and withdraw, perhaps waiting for his fleet to win at Artemisium and outflank the position. When neither happened, he ordered the attack. On the first day, he sent forward the Medes and Scythians, ethnic contingents from the Persian Empire. They advanced into the pass and engaged the Greeks in brutal, close-quarters fighting. The Persians quickly discovered the disadvantages of their equipment and tactics. They carried shorter spears than the Greeks, wicker shields rather than heavy bronze, and wore lighter armour. In the confined space of the pass, they could not use their mobility or archery effectively. The Greek hoplites, with their long spears, heavy shields, and bronze armour, formed an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. The Spartans fought in the front ranks, their training and discipline allowing them to maintain formation even under intense pressure. When one rank grew tired, another would smoothly take its place, a level of tactical sophistication other Greek forces could not match. Wave after wave of Persians advanced into the pass and were cut down by Greek spears. The narrow front meant that only a limited number of Persians could engage at any time, neutralizing their numerical advantage. The Spartans also employed tactical deceptions. They would pretend to retreat in disorder, drawing the Persians forward, then suddenly wheel about and attack, catching the pursuing Persians off balance. This feigned retreat and counterattack was a sophisticated maneuver requiring excellent training and discipline. After the Medes and Scythians suffered heavy casualties without breaching the Greek line, Xerxes committed his elite troops, the Immortals. These were the Persian royal guard, 10,000 strong, so named because whenever one of their number fell, another would immediately replace him, keeping their strength constant. The Immortals were the finest soldiers in the Persian army, veterans of many campaigns, equipped with the best weapons and armour Persia could provide. Yet even the Immortals could not break through. The Spartans and their allies held firm throughout the first day of battle. Ancient sources claim the Persians suffered thousands of casualties while Greek losses were relatively light. Xerxes, watching from his throne, reportedly leapt to his feet 3 times in alarm at the course of the battle, fearing for his army. The second day saw renewed Persian assaults with the same results. The Greeks maintained their position, inflicting heavy casualties on every Persian unit that advanced against them. The Spartans rotated with other Greek contingents to conserve their strength, but they bore the brunt of the heaviest fighting. The hot August sun beat down on the pass. The smell of blood and death filled the air. The Persians began to lose morale, realizing that simple courage and numbers would not be enough to overcome the Greek position. But the Greeks had a weakness they could not adequately defend: the Anapaia path. The mountain track that wound around the pass could allow an enemy to circumvent the defensive position entirely. Leonidas had posted 1,000 Phocians to guard this path, but the Phocians were local militia, not professional secret soldiers like the Spartans. On the night of the second day, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes, motivated by the promise of Persian gold, revealed the existence of this path to Xerxes. The Persian king immediately dispatched the Immortals under their commander Hydarnes to follow Ephialtes along the mountain route. They marched through the night, climbing the steep rocky trail. At dawn they encountered the Phocian guards. The Phocians, hearing the tramp of thousands of feet approaching, grabbed their weapons and took up defensive positions on high ground. But Hydarnes had no interest in fighting them. As soon as he realized these Greeks were not the main force, but only a guard detachment, he ordered his Immortals to shower them with arrows while continuing to march past. The Phocians, under missile fire and seeing the Persians passing them by rather than engaging directly, concluded that they were the primary target and retreated higher up the mountain to defend what they thought was the Persian objective. This misunderstanding was fatal to the Greek defence. The Persians were now free to descend the Anapaia path and emerge in the Greek rear. Leonidas learned of this development before dawn when scouts ran back to report the Persian flanking manoeuvre. He called a council of war. The position at Thermopylae was no longer defensible. The Greeks would be surrounded and annihilated between the main Persian army attacking from the front and the Immortals descending behind them. Leonidas made his decision. He ordered the bulk of the Greek army to withdraw immediately, to retreat southward while they still could. They would live to fight another day, to defend the Isthmus of Corinth or wherever else the Greeks would make their next stand, but Leonidas himself, with his 300 Spartans, would remain. The 700 Thespians volunteered to stay as well, along with 400 Thebans who may have been compelled to remain. The reasons for Leonidas' decision have been endlessly debated. The practical explanation is that someone had to guard the rear to allow the main army time to escape. A rearguard action, fighting to delay the pursuing Persians, was essential if the withdrawing Greeks were to avoid being caught in the open and slaughtered. The Spartans, as the finest warriors present, were the logical choice for this sacrifice. But there may have been deeper reasons. The oracle at Delphi had prophesied that either Sparta would fall to the Persians or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas may have believed that his death was fated, necessary to save his city. There were also considerations of honour and duty. The Spartans had come to Thermopylae to defend the pass. To retreat without fighting to the end would be shameful, a betrayal of their reputation and their values. Better to die fulfilling their mission than to live with dishonour. On the morning of the third day, Leonidas and his remaining force, perhaps 1,500 men in total, prepared for their final battle. They knew they would not survive. They knew the Persians would soon emerge in their rear while the main army attacked from the front, surrounding them completely. The Spartans reportedly ate a good breakfast that morning. When one of them remarked that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun, another Spartan replied that this was excellent news, as they would then fight in the shade. Leonidas led his men out from behind the wall, advancing into the wider part of the pass where they had more room to maneuver, They were no longer trying to hold a defensive position, they were attacking, trying to kill as many Persians as possible before being overwhelmed. The fighting was ferocious. The Spartans pushed deep into the Persian ranks, their long spears thrusting, their shields bashing, their swords slashing when their spears broke. Leonidas fell early in the battle, struck down by Persian spears and arrows. The Spartans, determined that his body should not be taken as a trophy, fought savagely around their fallen king. 4 times the Persians tried to seize the body. 4 times the Spartans drove them back, recovering their king's corpse at immense cost. The epitome of Spartan loyalty was on full display. They would defend their commander's body even in death, even when all hope was lost. As the morning wore on, the Spartans' spears shattered. They fought with swords. When their swords broke, ancient accounts claim they fought with their hands and teeth. Gradually they were driven back toward the wall, their numbers dwindling with each moment. The Immortals, having completed their flanking march, arrived in the Greek rear. The Spartans and their allies were now completely surrounded. The survivors, perhaps a few hundred men, made their last stand on a small hill near the wall. The Persians, having learned to respect the deadly efficiency of Greek close combat, held back and bombarded the hill with arrows and javelins. Wave after wave of missiles rained down on the defenders. One by one, the Greeks fell. When the last man dropped, silence descended on the pass. The Persians had won the battle, but at enormous cost. Ancient sources claim they lost 20,000 men over 3 days of fighting, though this figure is likely exaggerated. What is certain is that a force of 7,000 Greeks, and ultimately just 1,500, had held off the entire Persian army for 3 days, inflicting casualties out of all proportion to their numbers. Xerxes, furious at his losses and at Leonidas' defiance, ordered that the Spartan king's body be desecrated. His head was cut off and placed on a spike. This treatment of an enemy king's corpse was unprecedented and shocked the Greeks when they learned of it. It demonstrated both Xerxes' rage and the impression Leonidas had made on the Persian king. After Thermopylae, the Persians continued their advance southward. They overran Boeotia and marched on Athens. The Athenians evacuated their city, sending women, children, and elderly to safety while the men joined the fleet. Xerxes captured Athens and burned it to the ground in revenge for Athenian participation in the Ionian revolt years earlier, and for the Persian defeat at Marathon. But the Greek resistance was far from broken. The delay at Thermopylae had bought crucial time. The Greek fleet, having withdrawn from Artemisium after learning of Leonidas' defeat, took up position at Salamis, an island near Athens. There, in September 420 BC, in the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, the Greek fleet won a decisive victory over the Persian navy. Xerxes watched from shore as his ships were rammed, boarded, and sunk by the more maneuverable Greek triremes in the confined waters. The defeat at Salamis changed everything. Xerxes, fearing that the Greeks might sail to the Hellespont and destroy his bridge, cutting off his line of retreat, decided to return to Asia with much of his army. He left his general Mardonius in Greece with a substantial force to complete the conquest. But Mardonius faced a unified Greek resistance. In 479 BC, at the Battle of Plataea, the combined Greek armies, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, destroyed the Persian army. Mardonius was killed, and the surviving Persians retreated back to Asia. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet destroyed what remained of the Persian navy at the Battle of Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The Persian wars were over. Greece had survived. And while many cities and many heroes contributed to this victory, Thermopylae stood out. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 became legendary, the ultimate example of courage, discipline, and devotion to duty. The epitaph composed by the poet Simonides, inscribed at the battlefield, captured the Spartan ethos perfectly. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. Thermopylae demonstrated the effectiveness of Spartan military training and the power of Spartan values. 300 men, products of the agoge, had helped save Greece. But the battle also revealed potential weaknesses. The Spartans had been constrained by religious observances from sending their full army, a pattern that would repeat in future crises. They had relied on allies whose training and commitment did not match their own, and one of those allies had proven vulnerable to Persian gold. and ultimately, despite their extraordinary valour, they had been defeated. Nevertheless, Thermopylae secured Sparta's reputation as Greece's premier military power. For the next century and a half, no Greek army would willingly face the Spartans in open battle. The red-cloaked warriors with their lambda shields, advancing at a measured pace to the music of flutes, became the most feared soldiers in the Greek world. This military supremacy would allow Sparta to dominate Greece, to challenge Athens for supremacy, and ultimately to bring the entire Greek world under Spartan hegemony, however briefly. The seeds of that domination were planted at Thermopylae, watered with the blood of 300 Spartans who chose death over dishonour. The defeat of the Persian invasion left Greece free but divided. Two cities had emerged as the dominant powers, Athens and Sparta. They could hardly have been more different. Athens was a democracy, a naval power, the cultural and intellectual centre of Greece, its wealth built on trade and empire. Sparta was an oligarchy, a land power culturally conservative, its wealth based on agricultural estates worked by helots. These differences, combined with competition for influence over other Greek cities, made conflict between them almost inevitable. In the decades after the Persian Wars, Athens grew increasingly powerful. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance against Persia, gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. Athens collected tribute from member cities, used their resources to build a magnificent fleet and beautify Athens with monuments like the Parthenon, and intervened in the internal affairs of allied cities to support democratic factions. This growing Athenian power alarmed Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League. The immediate causes of war were incidents in Corcyra and Potidaea, cities where Athenian and Corinthian interests clashed. Corinth, a major Spartan ally, demanded that Sparta take action against Athens. Many Spartans were reluctant. King Archidamus, one of Sparta's two kings, argued that Sparta was unprepared for war. Athens had vast financial resources and a powerful navy, while Sparta had neither a significant treasury nor a fleet. Archidamus warned that the war might last years or even decades, but other voices prevailed. The F4 Leonidas gave a speech to the Spartan assembly, arguing that Spartan honour and the security of Sparta's allies required action. Athens, he claimed, was growing too powerful and would eventually threaten Sparta itself if not checked. The assembly voted for war. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War began, a conflict that would consume Greece for 27 years and end with Sparta's complete victory and Athens' surrender. The war divided into distinct phases. The first phase, called the Archidamian War, after King Archidamus, who led the initial Spartan invasions, lasted from 431 to 421 BC. Spartan strategy was straightforward. Invade Attica every summer, ravaging the countryside, destroying crops, and forcing the Athenians to fight in open battle where Spartan hoplites would crush them. But Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, refused to take the bait. The Athenians withdrew behind their long walls, fortifications that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus. Supplied by sea, protected by their walls, they could endure Spartan invasions indefinitely. Meanwhile, the Athenian fleet raided the Peloponnesian coast, striking Spartan and allied territory at will. This strategy frustrated the Spartans. They marched into Attica each summer, burned farms, cut down olive groves, and found no enemy willing to fight. The Athenians watched from their walls but did not march out to battle. This was not the kind of warfare Spartans understood. They had been trained for decisive hoplite battles, not prolonged stalemates and raiding campaigns. The Archidamian War ground on without either side achieving a decisive advantage. Athens suffered terribly from a plague that broke out in 430 BC, killing perhaps a quarter of its population, including Pericles himself. But the plague also affected Spartan troops, and Athens continued to resist. In 425 BC, the Athenians achieved a startling success, trapping a force of Spartans on the island of Sphacteria and forcing them to surrender. 120 Spartans, including several Spartiates, were taken prisoner and brought to Athens. This disaster shocked Sparta. The idea that Spartans would surrender rather than fight to the death contradicted everything Sparta stood for. The Spartans offered peace in exchange for their captured men, but Athens refused, sensing weakness. The war continued. In 424 BC, the Spartan general Brasidas led an expedition to Thrace, threatening Athenian interests in that region and even convincing some Athenian allies to revolt. Brasidas was an unusual Spartan, charismatic and diplomatic, as well as an excellent soldier, and his successes put pressure on Athens. By 421 BC, both sides were exhausted. The Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian general who negotiated it, ended the Archidemian War. The peace was supposed to last 50 years, but in reality it was merely an armed truce. Many of Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth, felt betrayed by the terms and refused to sign. Hostilities continued at a lower level, with proxy conflicts and shifting alliances. The peace collapsed completely when Athens launched an expedition to Sicily in 415 BC. This Sicilian expedition was Athens' bid to expand its empire and secure additional resources. Athens sent a massive force, over 100 ships, thousands of hoplites and rowers, some of the best commanders in Athens. If successful, the conquest of Sicily would make Athens the dominant power not just in Greece but in the entire Mediterranean. The expedition was a catastrophe. After 2 years of campaigning, the Athenian force was completely destroyed. The ships were captured or sunk, the soldiers were killed or enslaved in Syracusan quarries. Athens lost tens of thousands of men and dozens of ships, resources it could not easily replace. The disaster emboldened Sparta and Athens' enemies. The war resumed, entering a new phase sometime, called the Decelean War. Spartan strategy changed in this phase. Rather than seasonal invasions, Sparta established a permanent fort at Deceleia, in the Attic countryside just 14 miles from Athens. From this base, Spartan troops and their allies could raid Athenian territory year-round, preventing the Athenians from cultivating their land. Perhaps more importantly, Deceleia offered refuge to escaping Athenian slaves. Thousands of slaves, particularly skilled workers in the silver mines, fled to Deceleia, dealing a severe blow to the Athenian economy. Sparta also finally built a navy. The Spartans had always been weak at sea, but now Persian gold flowed into Spartan coffers. The Persian Empire, watching the Greek Civil War with interest, decided to support Sparta in exchange for Sparta's acquiescence to Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. This deal troubled some Spartans, who had fought the Persians decades earlier, but pragmatism prevailed. With Persian money, Sparta constructed a fleet and hired experienced crews. The war now centered on control of the Hellespont, the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Athens depended on grain shipments from the Black Sea region. If Sparta could block the Hellespont, Athens would starve. From 411 to 405 BC, a complex series of naval campaigns played out in the Aegean and along the coast of Asia Minor. Athens, despite its economic difficulties, proved remarkably resilient, winning several naval victories and even rebuilding its fleet when it was destroyed. But Athens' luck ran out in 405 BC at the Battle of Aegospotami. The Spartan admiral Lysander, a brilliant and ruthless commander who had cultivated close ties with Persian officials, surprised the Athenian fleet while it was beached, and most of its crews were ashore foraging for food. The Spartans captured or destroyed 170 Athenian ships. 3,000 Athenian prisoners were executed on Lysander's orders, an atrocity that demonstrated the bitterness the war had generated. With its fleet destroyed and the Hellespont blockaded, Athens faced starvation. The city held out through the winter of 405 to 404 BC, but by spring, with food supplies exhausted and no hope of relief, Athens surrendered. The terms were severe. Athens had to demolish its long walls and its fortifications at Piraeus, limiting its fleet to 12 ships and accepting Spartan supremacy in foreign policy. The Delian League was dissolved. Many of Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, argued that Athens should be destroyed completely, its male population killed, its women and children enslaved. But Sparta refused, perhaps out of respect for Athens' role in the Persian Wars, perhaps out of calculation that a weakened Athens could serve as a counterweight to other ambitious allies. Lysander installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy in Athens, known to history as the 30 Tyrants. These men, led by Critias, ruled Athens with brutal efficiency, executing or exiling democratic leaders and confiscating property. The reign of the 30 was short-lived. Within a year, Athenian democrats overthrew them and restored democracy, and Sparta, preoccupied with other matters, acquiesced. The Peloponnesian War was over. Sparta had won completely, reducing its great rival to impotence and establishing itself as the hegemon of Greece. The war had demonstrated the effectiveness of Spartan hoplites, the eventual adaptability of Spartan strategy, and the willingness of Spartan leaders to make hard choices, including the alliance with Persia that many Greeks viewed as shameful. But the war also revealed Spartan limitations. It had taken Sparta 27 years to defeat Athens, and only with massive Persian financial support. Sparta had struggled to develop an effective naval capability. Spartan commanders like Brasidas and Lysander, who showed initiative and political skill, were exceptions rather than the rule. The rigid Spartan system, designed to produce obedient soldiers, did not naturally produce flexible strategists or skilled diplomats. Moreover, the war had been devastating to Sparta demographically. Spartiate numbers, already declining, dropped further due to battlefield casualties. The earthquake of 464 BC and the subsequent Helot revolt had killed many Spartans. The losses in the Peloponnesian War, while lighter than Athens' casualties, still reduced the already small pool of full citizens. By the end of the war, there may have been fewer than 3,000 Spartiates, a dangerously small number to maintain control over tens of thousands of helots and to dominate Greece. The victory in the Peloponnesian War marked the peak of Spartan power. For the next 3 decades, Sparta would be the dominant force in Greek affairs, intervening in the internal politics of other cities, imposing its will through military might and diplomatic pressure. But this hegemony would prove brief. The very factors that had allowed Sparta to win the war, its military excellence, its social cohesion, its unwillingness to compromise, would become liabilities in the more complex political environment of post-war Greece. Within a generation, Sparta would suffer a catastrophic military defeat that would end its dominance forever and reveal the fundamental weaknesses in its system. The years immediately following Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War should have been a period of triumph and consolidation. Sparta was the undisputed master of Greece, its military undefeated in open battle, its influence extending across the Greek world. But Spartan hegemony proved remarkably short-lived and ultimately disastrous for Sparta itself. Within 30 years of victory over Athens, Sparta would suffer a military defeat so total that it would never recover. The story of Sparta's decline is a tragedy of rigidity, declining numbers, and an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The fundamental problem was demographic. The number of Spartiates continued its inexorable decline. War casualties, the strict requirements for maintaining citizenship, and apparently low birth rates meant that fewer and fewer men met the criteria to be full citizens. Ancient sources suggest that by 371 BC, there were only about 1,500 Spartiates, down from perhaps 8,000 in 480 BC. With each generation, the citizen body shrank, concentrating land ownership in fewer hands and reducing the military manpower Sparta could field. This decline in citizen numbers became known as oliganthropia, literally fewness of men. Ancient observers proposed various explanations. Aristotle blamed the inheritance laws that allowed land to be concentrated through marriage and bequest. Others pointed to the costly requirements of the syssitia, which forced men who could not afford contributions to lose citizenship. Some modern historians suggest that Spartan women, having control over their own reproduction, may have chosen to limit family size. Whatever the causes, the result was clear. Sparta's military strength rested on an ever-shrinking foundation. Sparta's behaviour as a hegemon also created problems. The Spartans installed oligarchic governments in cities that had previously been democracies, often backed by Spartan garrisons and governors called harmosts. These officials were frequently corrupt and oppressive, enriched by bribes and abusing their power. Lysander, the victor of Agoge, was particularly ruthless, establishing networks of loyal oligarchs throughout the Greek world who owed their positions to him personally. This created resentment even among Sparta's traditional allies, who had fought alongside Sparta against Athens only to find themselves subjected to Spartan domination. The alliance with Persia also proved problematic. In exchange for Persian gold, Sparta had agreed to cede the Greek cities of Asia Minor back to Persian control. These were the same cities whose freedom Sparta had claimed to be fighting for during the Peloponnesian War. When Sparta attempted to enforce this agreement, sending forces to compel the Asian Greeks to accept Persian rule, it provoked outrage throughout Greece. Sparta's reputation as the defender of Greek liberty, earned at Thermopylae, was severely damaged. King Agesilaus II, who came to power in 309 BC, tried to restore Spartan prestige by launching a campaign in Asia Minor against Persia. Agesilaus was an effective military commander, and his campaigns in 396–395 BC were initially successful. But his efforts were undermined by developments in Greece itself. Several major Greek cities, Thebes, Corinth, Athens and Argos, formed a coalition against Sparta backed by Persian gold. Persia had shifted its support from Sparta to Sparta's enemies, realizing that a balance of power in Greece served Persian interests better than Spartan dominance. This conflict, known as the Corinthian War, lasted from 395 to 387 BC. Agesilaus was forced to abandon his Asian campaign and return to Greece. At the Battle of Coronea in 394 BC, he defeated the coalition army but suffered heavy casualties in the process. More importantly, the Spartan navy was destroyed at the Battle of Cnidus, ending Sparta's brief period as a significant naval power. The war dragged on inconclusively until 387 BC, when Persia imposed a peace settlement. The king's peace, also called the Peace of Antalcidas after the Spartan diplomat who negotiated it, gave Persia control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor and the island of Cyprus. In return, Persia guaranteed the independence of all other Greek cities and backed Sparta's position as the enforcer of this peace. It was a diplomatic victory for Sparta, but a moral defeat, confirming Sparta's willingness to sacrifice Greek freedom for its own advantage. During the 380s and 370s BC, Sparta used its position to intervene repeatedly in other Greek cities' affairs. The Spartans broke up the Boeotian League, forcing Thebes and other Boeotian cities to operate independently rather than as a federation. They garrisoned the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, imposing oligarchic rule on the city. They intervened in Phlius, Mantinea and other cities, breaking up democracies and installing pro-Spartan oligarchies. These interventions bred resentment and made Sparta appear hypocritical, enforcing a peace that supposedly guaranteed city-state independence, while constantly violating that independence when it suited Spartan interests. In Thebes, Spartan high-handedness provoked resistance. In 379 BC, Theban Democrats, led by Pelopidas and Epaminondas, overthrew the pro-Spartan government and expelled the Spartan garrison. Thebes reconstituted the Boeotian League and began preparing for inevitable Spartan retaliation. Sparta sent multiple expeditions against Thebes, but none achieved decisive results. The Thebans, under the military leadership of Epaminondas, developed new tactics and trained their sacred band, an elite unit of 300 men, to fight with unprecedented effectiveness. The confrontation between Sparta and Thebes came to a head in 371 BC at the Battle of Leuctra. King Cleombrotus led a Spartan army of about 10,000 men, including 700 Spartiates, into Boeotia. The Theban army, commanded by Epaminondas, numbered perhaps 6,000. By traditional calculation, the Spartans should have won easily. They had numerical superiority and were facing an enemy that had never defeated Sparta in a major battle. But Epaminondas had revolutionized Greek military tactics. Traditional hoplite battles were pushing matches between phalanxes of equal depth, typically 8 ranks deep. The stronger side would gradually push back the weaker until one side broke and fled. Epaminondas understood that Spartan excellence meant the Spartan right wing, where the king and the elite troops fought, would almost certainly defeat any force facing it. So he concentrated overwhelming force on his own left wing, massing his best troops, including the sacred band, in a column 50 ranks deep. This formation, called the oblique phalanx, was designed to strike with overwhelming power at the decisive point. Epaminondas refused his right and centre, holding them back, while throwing his deep left wing forward against the Spartan right. The mass and momentum of 50 ranks of Theban hoplites smashed into the 12-rank deep Spartan formation like a battering ram. The Battle of Leuctra on July 6, 371 BC lasted less than an hour but changed the course of Greek history. The Theban left wing, using its superior depth and weight, drove straight through the Spartan right. King Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting, along with 400 Spartiates, more than half the Spartiate force present, and a devastating blow to a citizen body that numbered fewer than 1,500. The rest of the Spartan army, seeing their king dead and their elite troops defeated, retreated in disorder. It was Sparta's first significant defeat in a major land battle in living memory. The myth of Spartan invincibility, cultivated since Thermopylae and reinforced by generations of victories, shattered in a single afternoon. The psychological impact on both Sparta and the rest of Greece was profound. If Sparta could be defeated in open battle, then everything was possible. Greek city-states that had submitted to Spartan dominance now contemplated resistance. Epaminondas followed up his victory by invading the Peloponnese itself, something no enemy had successfully done in centuries. In 370 BC, he led a Theban-Arcadian army deep into Laconia, reaching the outskirts of Sparta proper. The city, which had never needed walls because its warriors were its walls, now faced invasion. The Spartans managed to defend their city, using defensive positions along the Eurotas River and mobilizing every available man, including helots and perioikoi, but they could not prevent Epaminondas from devastating the Laconian countryside. Even more catastrophic was Epaminondas' liberation of Messenia. For nearly 300 years, Messenia had been under Spartan control, its population enslaved as helots, its agricultural produce supporting the Spartiate lifestyle. Epaminondas founded a new city, Messene, as the capital of a free Messenian state and invited all former helots to join it. Thousands responded, fleeing Spartan control and establishing an independent Messenia with Theban backing. The loss of Messenia was a death blow to the Spartan system. The economic foundation of Sparta's way of life had rested on helot labour, particularly Messenian helot labour. With Messenia independent, the kleros that had supported each Spartiate citizen no longer produced income. The remaining helots in Laconia were insufficient to support the citizen body in the manner to which they were accustomed. Many Spartiates could no longer afford their contributions to the Syssitia and lost, their citizenship further accelerating the demographic decline. Sparta attempted to adapt to its new circumstances, but with limited success. The city allied with Athens, its former bitter enemy, in an attempt to contain Theban power. Agesilaus, though now elderly, continued to lead Spartan forces. In 362 BC, Sparta and Athens confronted Thebes and its allies at the Battle of Mantinea. It was another tactical masterpiece by Epaminondas, using cavalry and combined arms to break the allied line. But in the moment of victory, Epaminondas was mortally wounded. His death, according to ancient sources, left Thebes leaderless and its military innovations without their architect. The battle was technically a Theban victory, but it ended Theban dominance of Greece as effectively as Leuctra had ended Sparta's. The Battle of Mantinea essentially ended the period of Greek history known as the Greek city-state era. No single city-state could dominate Greece any longer. Sparta was broken, Athens was weakened, Thebes lost its genius commander. Into this power vacuum came Macedon, a kingdom in northern Greece that had been reorganizing itself under King Philip II. Philip was a student of Greek military innovations. He had been a hostage in Thebes during Epaminondas' prime and learned from Theban tactics. But he developed his own innovations, creating the Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas, pikes 18 feet long, and combining it with heavy cavalry and light troops in a combined arms approach more sophisticated than anything the Greeks had developed. More importantly, Philip had the resources of a kingdom, not a city-state. He could field professional armies, campaign year-round, and pursue consistent long-term strategies. Sparta watched Philip's rise with alarm but could do little to stop it. The Spartans refused to join the coalition of Greek cities that opposed Philip, partly out of distrust of Athens and Thebes, who were coalition leaders, partly out of a stubborn belief in Spartan exceptionalism. In 388 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed the Greek coalition, establishing Macedonian hegemony over Greece. Philip formed the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek cities under Macedonian leadership designed to unite Greece for a campaign against Persia. All major Greek cities joined the League of Corinth, all except Sparta. The Spartans refused, declaring that it was not the Spartan way to follow others, but to lead. Philip, recognizing that forcing Spartan compliance would be costly and unnecessary, left them alone. Sparta remained independent but isolated, its territory reduced, its power broken, its former glory a fading memory. The once dominant city-state had become an irrelevance in the new Macedonian-dominated Greek world. Philip was assassinated in 3x BC, and his son Alexander became king. Alexander led the united Greek and Macedonian forces in a campaign of conquest that subdued the Persian Empire and extended Macedonian control to India. Sparta played no part in these world-shaking events. When Thebes revolted against Alexander in 325 BC, Alexander destroyed the city and enslaved its population as a lesson to other Greeks. Sparta, safely irrelevant, was left unmolested. During Alexander's absence in Asia, Sparta attempted one final assertion of power. In 321 BC, King Aegeus III assembled an army of Spartans and allies and tried to force other Peloponnesian cities to revolt against Macedonian authority. Alexander's regent in Greece, Antipater, marched south with a massive army. At Megalopolis, Aegeus and his forces were crushed. Aegeus himself died fighting, along with hundreds of Spartans. It was a glorious death in the Spartan tradition, but it was also pointless. Sparta had achieved nothing except more casualties from its dwindling citizen body. After this defeat, Sparta accepted its subordinate position. The city maintained its independence and its peculiar customs, but it was no longer a significant power in Greek affairs. The Hellenistic period, following Alexander's death and the division of his empire among his generals, saw Sparta reduced to a second-tier city-state, occasionally involved in regional conflicts, but never again a major player on the world stage. In the 3rd century BC, Sparta experienced a brief revival under reforming kings Aegeus IV and Cleomenes III. These kings attempted to restore the traditional Spartan system, redistributing land, expanding the citizen body, and recreating the agoge. Cleomenes achieved some military success, but Sparta was now operating in a world dominated by the vast Hellenistic kingdoms of the Ptolemies, Seleucids, and Antigonids. Macedon intervened to crush Cleomenes' reforms, and Sparta returned to decline. The Roman conquest of Greece in the mid-2nd century BC found Sparta still clinging to its identity but stripped of all real power. The Romans, who admired Spartan discipline and military traditions, treated Sparta relatively well. The city was allowed to maintain its traditional constitution and customs, becoming something of a tourist attraction, where wealthy Romans came to observe the peculiar Spartan way of life. The agoge continued, though in an increasingly ritualized and attenuated form. Spartan boys still underwent harsh training, but now it was more performance than genuine military education. In 146 BC, Rome decisively asserted control over Greece following the Achaean War. Sparta, which had allied with Rome against the Achaean League, emerged from this conflict relatively unscathed. The city became part of the Roman province of Achaea, though it retained local autonomy and continued to be governed by its traditional institutions. Roman officials and tourists visited Sparta to witness the peculiar customs that still endured, watching young Spartans compete in athletic contests and endure ritual whippings at the altar of Artemis Orthia. During the Roman imperial period, Sparta experienced something of a cultural revival, though it was more about nostalgia than genuine restoration of ancient power. The Romans romanticized Sparta's military heritage and encouraged the preservation of Spartan traditions. The city benefited from imperial patronage, with emperors funding construction projects and allowing Sparta special privileges. The Spartan elite carefully cultivated their image as the inheritors of a glorious tradition, even as the reality of that tradition became increasingly distant from daily life. The agoge persisted in modified form through the Roman period, but it had transformed from a genuine military training system into a ritualized coming-of-age ceremony. The whipping contest at the altar of Artemis Orthia, in which young men competed to endure flogging without crying out, became a popular spectacle for Roman tourists. The ancient training ground where Leonidas and his warriors had prepared for Thermopylae had become a tourist attraction, the Spartan way of life reduced to entertainment for foreign visitors. Christianity's spread through the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries AD gradually eroded the pagan religious practices that had been integral to Spartan identity. The ancient cults, the festivals, the rituals that had defined Spartan life for centuries were suppressed or abandoned. The last recorded celebration of the Hyacinthia, one of Sparta's major religious festivals, occurred in the 4th century AD. The transformation from pagan Sparta to Christian Sparta marked the final breaking of continuity with the ancient past. The city continued to exist through the Byzantine period and into the medieval era, but it was now indistinguishable from other provincial towns in the Byzantine Empire. The once fearsome warriors had become farmers and craftsmen. The strict social hierarchy had dissolved. The helots were long gone, freed or assimilated into the general population. The unique Spartan way of life, which had made the city famous throughout the ancient world, had vanished completely. In 1249, the medieval town that bore the name Sparta was abandoned after William XVI of Villehardouin built a new fortress at nearby Mistras. For centuries, the site of ancient Sparta lay uninhabited, its buildings quarried for stone, its glory preserved only in history books and in the imaginations of those who read about Leonidas and his 300. The agricultural land of the Eurotas Valley supported scattered villages, but there was no city at Sparta. Modern Sparta was refounded in 1834 after Greek independence from Ottoman rule. The new Greek state, seeking to connect itself with ancient Hellenic glory, established a new city on the ancient site. This modern Sparta is a provincial capital, a pleasant town in the southern Peloponnese, but it bears little resemblance to its ancient namesake. Where once stood the barracks of the agoge, there are now schools teaching standard Greek curriculum. Where warriors trained for battle, tourists walk through archaeological sites. Where helots once toiled under Spartiate supervision, olive groves are worked by free farmers. The contrast between ancient Sparta and every other aspect of Greek life was what made it remarkable. In a world of individualism, Sparta demanded conformity. In a culture that celebrated intellectual achievement, Sparta prized physical prowess and obedience. In an era of democratic experimentation, Sparta maintained its ancient oligarchy. For 3 centuries, this unique system produced military excellence unmatched in the Greek world. But that same rigidity, that resistance to change, that narrow focus on military training above all else, ultimately doomed Sparta to irrelevance. The story of Sparta's decline is in many ways more instructive than the story of its rise. It demonstrates the dangers of an inflexible system that cannot adapt to changing circumstances. It shows how demographic decline, if unchecked, can destroy even the most powerful state. It reveals the limits of military excellence when not combined with economic vitality, diplomatic skill, and the ability to expand one's citizen base. And it illustrates how a society built on the exploitation of an enslaved population becomes fatally vulnerable when that population is lost. The story of Sparta is complete, from its origins as a collection of villages in the Eurotas Valley, through its transformation under Lycurgus into a unique warrior society, its moment of glory at Thermopylae, its victory in the Peloponnesian War, and its sudden collapse at Leuctra, to its long, slow decline into irrelevance. Sparta's history encompasses triumph and tragedy in equal measure. No ancient society has captured the modern imagination quite like Sparta. The image of the 300 at Thermopylae, standing against impossible odds, choosing death over surrender, has become a timeless symbol of courage and sacrifice. The red-cloaked warriors advancing to the music of flutes, disciplined, fearless, knighted, represent an ideal of military excellence that continues to inspire. The Spartan commitment to duty, the willingness to subordinate individual desires to collective needs, the emphasis on physical fitness and mental toughness, all of these resonate with modern audiences, but Sparta's legacy is profoundly ambiguous. The same system that produced heroes like Leonidas also produced the Crypteia, young men stalking helots by night and murdering them to maintain a regime of terror. The discipline that made the Spartan phalanx invincible also created a rigid, inflexible society incapable of adapting to change. The emphasis on equality among citizens rested on the exploitation of a much larger enslaved population. The military excellence came at the cost of cultural stagnation, with Sparta producing no philosophers, playwrights, historians, or artists of note during its classical period. The ancient Greeks themselves had mixed feelings about Sparta. They admired Spartan courage and discipline, but found Spartan society strange and often repellent. Athenians in particular contrasted their open, democratic, intellectually vibrant society with closed, oligarchic, militaristic Sparta. Yet even Athens' strongest democrats sometimes admitted envy of Spartan stability and military success. Xenophon, an Athenian who spent much time with Spartans, wrote admiringly of their system. Plato incorporated Spartan elements into his vision of an ideal society. Aristotle, more critical, nevertheless devoted considerable attention to analysing Spartan institutions. Modern assessments of Sparta have varied dramatically depending on the era and the observer's own political values. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many European and American thinkers admired Sparta as a model of republican virtue, civic dedication, and martial excellence. The founding fathers of the United States, educated in classical literature, often reference Spartan examples in their writings. Revolutionary France briefly adopted Spartan-inspired reforms, though these did not last. The 20th century saw both enthusiastic embrace and fierce rejection of the Spartan model. Totalitarian regimes, both fascist and communist, looked to Sparta as a predecessor, pointing to its subordination of individual to state, its militarism, and its rigid social control. Nazi Germany in particular romanticised Sparta, seeing in it a model of racial superiority and warrior culture. This association has inevitably coloured modern perceptions, making any admiration of Sparta potentially suspect. Contemporary historians generally take a more nuanced view. They recognise Sparta's genuine achievements, its remarkable military system, its unusual status for women, its longevity as a stable political entity, but they also emphasise the cost of these achievements, the brutality toward helots, the stifling of individual development, the ultimate failure of the system to sustain itself. Modern scholarship has worked to move beyond the mythologized Sparta created by ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, who wrote centuries after Sparta's peak, and whose accounts mixed fact with legend. Archaeological work at Sparta and in Laconia has complicated our understanding. The material record shows a less austere society than literary sources suggested. Spartans imported fine pottery and luxury goods. They dedicated elaborate votives at their sanctuaries. Their early period saw the production of beautiful bronzework and ivories. This suggests that the extreme austerity described by later sources may have been more an ideal than a consistent reality, or that Spartan culture changed significantly over time, becoming more austere as military pressures intensified. The question of what lessons, if any, modern societies can learn from Sparta remains contentious. On one level, Sparta's emphasis on physical fitness, discipline, and service to community offers values that many find admirable. The willingness of Spartan citizens to sacrifice personal comfort for collective security, their emphasis on duty over pleasure, their ideal of excellence achieved through rigorous training, these principles can seem attractive in an era of individualism and immediate gratification. But the Spartan model also offers cautionary lessons. It demonstrates how a society overly focused on military preparation can lose the capacity for cultural creativity and intellectual innovation. It shows how demographic decline can undermine even the most powerful military system if the citizen base is not maintained or expanded. It reveals how a society built on exploiting others becomes vulnerable when that exploitation can no longer be sustained. And it illustrates how rigid adherence to tradition and resistance to change can transform strength into weakness when circumstances change. Perhaps the most important lesson from Sparta is about the relationship between military power and civilization. Sparta created the finest army of its era, but produced virtually nothing else of lasting value. It left behind no literature, no philosophy, no art or architecture that significantly influenced subsequent cultures. The ruins at Sparta are modest compared to those at Athens, Olympia, or Delphi. What Sparta has bequeathed to history is primarily its military reputation and the stories of its warriors. Athens, by contrast, was militarily weaker than Sparta, but culturally immensely productive. Athenian democracy, drama, philosophy, history, architecture, and sculpture shaped Western civilization in ways that continue to resonate. When we think of ancient Greece's contributions to human culture, we think primarily of Athens, not Sparta. In the long run, the Parthenon and the plays of Sophocles have proven more enduring than the Spartan phalanx. Yet the Spartan story retains its power precisely because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the capacity for extraordinary courage and self-discipline in service of a cause larger than oneself. The stand at Thermopylae, whatever its strategic significance, represents an ideal of heroic sacrifice that transcends its historical context. Leonidas and his 300 have become mudvun, in the modern imagination, symbols of resistance against tyranny, of the few standing against the many, of choosing death with honour over life with shame. This mythologization of Sparta began in antiquity and has continued ever since. The real Sparta, with its contradictions and complexities, has been repeatedly transformed into an idealized Sparta that serves various political and cultural agendas. The challenge for historians is to appreciate both the reality and the myth, to understand what Sparta actually was, while also recognizing the powerful hold it has exercised on human imagination for more than 2 millennia. In the end, Sparta's story is a human story, of people trying to solve the fundamental problem of how to organize society, how to balance individual freedom against collective security, how to maintain order and defend against enemies while also allowing for prosperity and human flourishing. Sparta's solution to these problems was radical, and for a time remarkably successful. But it was also limited and ultimately unsustainable. The rigid system that created Thermopylae also created the conditions for Leuctra and Sparta's long decline into obscurity. As we look back across 25 centuries at the ruins in the Eurotas Valley, at the scattered evidence of a vanished way of life, we can acknowledge both Sparta's achievements and its failures. We can admire the courage of those who stood at Thermopylae, while also recognizing the brutality of the system that produced them. We can learn from both Sparta's strengths and its weaknesses, drawing insights for our own time while avoiding the temptation to either romanticize or demonize this most unusual of ancient societies. Sparta was unique in the ancient world, and its uniqueness is precisely what makes it so enduringly fascinating. In an age of city-states, it created a military camp. In a culture that celebrated individual achievement, it demanded absolute conformity. In a world where slavery was common, it built its entire society on enslaved labour to a degree no other Greek state matched. It produced warriors of legendary skill but little else. It dominated Greece for a generation, and then collapsed with shocking suddenness. It left behind few physical monuments but an enormous cultural legacy, its warriors marching through history books, inspiring, troubling and fascinating generation after generation. The story of Sparta, from its legendary lawgiver Lycurgus to its final irrelevance under Roman rule, encompasses the full arc of rise and fall, glory and decline that characterises all human civilizations. It reminds us that military power alone cannot sustain a society, that demographic vitality matters, that adaptability is essential for survival, that exploitation of others creates long-term vulnerabilities, and that cultures that fail to renew themselves eventually wither and die. Yet Sparta also reminds us of human capacity for discipline, sacrifice and courage. The men who stood at Thermopylae, who trained their whole lives for a moment they knew would probably end in death, who chose to stay at their posts when they could have retreated, who died to buy time for their fellow Greeks, these men exemplify virtues that every society claims to value. That their society had profound flaws does not diminish their individual courage. That their sacrifice served a system built on helot labour does not make that sacrifice less real. Sparta's legacy is complex, contradictory, troubling, and inspiring in equal measure. It is a legacy that continues to generate debate, to provoke thought, to serve as a reference point in discussions about military culture, civic virtue, social organisation, and the proper relationship between individual and state. 25 centuries after its peak, Sparta still matters, not because we should emulate it, we should not and could not, but because its story illuminates eternal questions about how human beings organise themselves, what they value, what they sacrifice, and what they leave behind.